introduce to today to the workshop a colleague and friend of mine, Randy Law. And he's here today to lead this workshop that we have here on the subject of terrorism. The workshop, let me get the plugs in here, is jointly sponsored by the Global Studies Center at Pitt and Center for Russian and East European Studies. And let me just say a few words about Randy before we get started. He is currently an associate professor at Birmingham-Southern College. Received his bachelor's from Amherst College, that was in Russian. He got his MA in Russian Studies from Yale University and a PhD in History with concentrations in Russian and Modern Europe from Georgetown. Before he took a job at Birmingham-Southern in 2003, he worked at Northwestern College, University of Utah, and Westminster College in Salt Lake City. And since 2010, he has been the adjunct of the American Security Project, where he's been writing works and articles and other briefs on the history of terrorism and terrorism in Russia. He was a Fulbright Scholar to Odessa in 2009, where he was examining representations of early 20th century terrorism in the region. And his first book, which most of you now have copies of, Terrorism History, was published by Polity Press, and amongst the other very positive reviews it received, it was quoted as the essential work on the subject, one that is provocative and educational and will stimulate a necessary dialogue for future decision makers. I hope that Randy will help stimulate an educational dialogue here for educators. And so in that spirit, I want to turn the floor over to Randy.
Thank you, Andy. It's very good to be here. My education, where I got turned on to education, was small liberal arts college, and Birmingham-Southern is a small liberal arts college in Birmingham, Alabama. That's where I've been for 10 years, and that's what I love. So I love nothing more than being in a small room with folks who are engaged and interested, and I'm hoping willing to take part in a very informal sort of discussion. If need be, I kick into the professor lecture mode, but I'm hoping mostly that we get to talk, and that I'm very, very curious to hear a lot from you, and I want to learn from you how your students encounter the subject of terrorism, how you do, how the subject gets broached in your classroom, and to present you with some ideas and some material that I hope you can use. But also I want to hear from you about what you have found that works or doesn't work, or what provokes discussions. So I'm excited to learn from this as well. Well, I thought I would walk through some basic talking points that I have organized over the years that guide me, that I've learned from reading and studying terrorism, and that I have in turn used to sort of guide me as I think about terrorism, both as a scholar of it and as a teacher. I teach, actually, let me give more of a word about myself. I'm trained as a Russian historian, but I was hired where I am now as a European historian. So I teach both halves of the European survey, civilization survey, so I'm very much a generalist. I teach courses on the French Revolution, Russian history, German history, upper level research seminars with my students on 20th century history, the Cold War, and I teach a couple courses on the history of terrorism, but they're essentially introductory courses. They're lower level surveys, no prerequisites, that are, I like having history majors in those courses, but they're particularly geared toward a broad audience, and I try to take advantage of the fact that I've got students coming to that class who are majors in disciplines all across the campus and aren't necessarily historians. So as I said, I wanted to walk through a couple points that any of which we could spend hours and days discussing, and some of which I accept are maybe contentious or polemical, and we can get into it on any of these. But then, well, let me walk through these and see where this takes us. Okay, the first one is, in some ways, the first point I want to make, it is the most basic point I could make, perhaps, but it's also in some ways about as contentious and polemical as it gets, which is to say that in most regards there is not much new about terrorism today. Historians are always keen to make the assertion that there is nothing new under the sun, that we've encountered what we've encountered today, in some sort of guise from the past. And of course, the idea being that if you have a familiarity with the past, or have those intellectual tools for trying to meet the past on its own terms and understand it, that you're then well disposed to meet the challenges of today because you can find something old in the new. And I think that's very much the case about terrorism. You'll notice several of you have copies of the books. I guess you just picked up the books, right? So I can't assume that you've all read it from cover to cover. You're just like my students, even if you've been given it 3 months in advance. You'll notice if you start flipping through the book, I start with the ancient world. I spend time with the Hebrew Bible, with Scripture, with the Greeks, with the Romans, with, in particular, a group from 1st century AD, the Sicarii, who staged a revolt against the Romans in Jerusalem. I speak about the military practices of the Assyrians in the ancient world. So I am keen to, I'm keen to look back very far to find roots and to find continuities. I'm also eager to point out where there are things that are new introduced to the story. But that terrorism is something that's been with us for a very long time. It is not something that only dates from 9/11, to be sure. Lots of textbooks begin histories of terrorism from 1968, because that was the year that various subgroups of the Palestine Liberation Organization started using hijackings and other forms of international terrorism to spread the message about the Palestinians. But there is nothing magical about that date as far as I'm concerned either. And it's not just that terrorism is an old phenomenon with which Americans, with which humans have had this long history and this long experience, but it is a phenomenon with which Americans have a long and I would say disturbing familiarity with. History is, and there are some really wonderful texts on this that chart the course of the history of terrorism in the colonies in the United States, that really make a case that this particular kind of violence, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways I define it, that it is very much a part of the American experience. And there's nothing alien about terrorism or the use of this kind of violence to the American experience, and that it's not something that has been imposed upon us by them over there, but it is something that us, have long used against others and against each other as well. I think there are sort of polemical ways that you can introduce the topic of terrorism to early American history, but when I teach courses on the history of terrorism, I spend a lot of time talking about the whole arc from John Brown through the Civil War through the period of Reconstruction. And that lends itself to talking about a lot of different kinds of terrorism used in a lot of different ways against a lot of different kinds of topics. John Brown, who I would say was really fits the bill when trying to talk about not just a terrorist, but sort of the mentality of the terrorist and his effort to provoke a race war, essentially, by seizing the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry. Yeah.
Would you fit on the other side of that? The other side of the coin, would you fit Bleeding Kansas in that as well?
Yeah, that was his training ground.
Right.
And of course there there's a continuum. I try not to erect too many definitional walls between the use of terrorism and say guerrilla combat, guerrilla fighting. But Bleeding Kansas in the years just leading up to the Civil War, those retributive attacks against civilians. And then that's actually how the war continued. I'm actually from Kansas City. I grew up in Kansas, so Bleeding Kansas is my home. And don't get me started on Kansas versus Missouri. So, and the fighting, the violence of Bleeding Kansas actually carried over and was really the sort of fighting that took place during the Civil War in Kansas and Missouri. Very few conventional battles between North and South in Missouri. They were small-scale skirmishes, and a lot of it was violence against civilians. It was small-time raids, and it was violence that was meant to intimidate not enemy soldiers, but enemy civilian populations. And then the end of the war is quickly followed with a case that is a great example of what I call, and what is called by others, tyrannicide in the ancient world, an act of premeditated murder, of assassination, to rid a people of a hated tyrant. The Bible is chock full of these examples. The Greeks and the Romans really celebrated these people who carried out tyrannicides. And I'm speaking here, of course, of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which was widely greeted in the South as a people being delivered from a hated tyrant. And then after the end of the Civil War, really the Civil War doesn't end. It continues under a different guise when the North tries to impose, as Southerners understood it, a new revolution to transform Southern society during the period of radical Reconstruction. And a lot of Southern patriots responded by waging a hidden war, sometimes something we might characterize as guerrilla warfare, but I think really best characterized as a campaign of terrorism against the governments that were imposed in the South by the northern aggressors, and against the people who supported them, freed blacks and the whites who supported those reconstructed governments in the South. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the way that Reconstruction ended. That somehow the Klan and the various white supremacist organizations were defeated, and that Reconstruction could be called off because the South had been sort of brought to heel and brought into line and adopted the values that were prevalent in the North about race and the role of the federal government. Absolutely not. It was a truce. The North grew tired of trying to impose its will on the South and having to budget the dollars that were necessary to do so. And they essentially declared victory and went home. And so the Klan melted away, not because it was defeated, but because it had won. Because it had forced acquiescence, and so the Klan no longer had to operate as a kind of paramilitary force. And so the terrorism of the Klan as a paramilitary force during Reconstruction in the South was replaced by lynching, which was more sporadic, but was even more visible to remind blacks and whites alike, of the proper relations between the races. So lynching, I would consider to be a form of terrorism during this era as well. It's always open to definition, but as I counted, the United States has waged at least 5 different wars on terror. One of them would be the North in the South during Reconstruction, waging a conflict against the Klan and related organizations. In the 70s and 80s, particularly highlighted by the Haymarket riot, or Haymarket bombing in Chicago in 1886, there was something that was akin to a declared war against the terrorism being used by anarchists, foreigners, and subversives. Again, this returned around the turn of the century, particularly in the 1910s, associated with all the labor strife in the United States. There were conspiratorial campaigns to carry out anarchist-inspired terrorism against the symbols of American economic power up until the 1990s, up until 95, and Timothy McVeigh's detonation of the bomb outside the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Up till that point, the act of domestic terrorism that had killed the most Americans was a bomb detonated by probably an anarchist, anarcho-terrorist, on Wall Street in 1920 that killed about 40 or 50 people, and was widely caught up with a Red Scare and itself a war on terror. Probably the moment before our current war on terror, where the word itself circulated the most, was in the 1980s. In the wake of the Iran hostage crisis, lots of international terrorism carried out by PLO organizations, but particularly Hezbollah's attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut in October 1983. America's confrontation with Muammar Gaddafi, if you remember the line in the sand, or probably the line across the Gulf of Sidra. American attacks against Gaddafi's compound in Tripoli, one of which actually killed his an adopted daughter, a stepdaughter. And this was a widely discussed concept, and this was posited as a threat that really rivaled that of the Soviet Union during the Cold War at times in the 1980s, this war against international terrorism. And so for a lot of Americans, arguably, of course, younger Americans, folks who are your students, my students, and even a generation older, 9/11 seemed very new, but for those who are willing to look elsewhere, it seemed in fact very old, except of course for the scale of it. The scale of it was very different. So that was a long exposition, but really highlighting that to me, terrorism is not a terribly new idea, not a terribly new phenomenon, and that if we become familiar with this history of terrorism in all of its various guises, we're equipped with a lot of questions that allow us to make sense of today's headlines. Basically, when I teach the course, I teach it almost as a preparation, reading the newspaper 101. Pick up the newspaper, how is the term terrorism deployed? What does the newspaper, well, of course for our students, they're not reading newspapers. When you look at Yahoo News or hear a little bit on the radio or the TV or whatever it might be, how is this term deployed? What does it mean? And I'm trying to get them to ask questions which all too often the news broadcasts don't provide good answers to, but they can maybe do a little bit of research on their own. So First of all, so,
Budget cuts, sorry.
you got the old cheap shot here.
Sawdust in there now.
I've got my own shot. So, for a basic idea, terrorism is old. Another pillar of, and again, I'm not necessarily an innovator on this. I try to maybe be a little bit of a popularizer, but on this count, I'm not an innovator at all. The notion that terrorism is best understood and its significance is best appreciated when you consider it as a tactic. All too often, we are led astray by the word itself. Not only, and we go on and on about how the word itself has become so chock full of emotional resonance. We find it almost impossible to use this as a neutral term. It has such emotional resonance for us. But the word, as it's etymologically constructed itself, is problematic. Because when you think of the word terrorism, what other isms are called to mind? How do we often try to explain a word when we just break it down? Terrorism, it sounds like what? Communism, liberalism, conservatism, Marxism, socialism, nationalism, so on and so forth. As if terrorism is an ideology. As if terrorism is imparts an entire worldview, an ideology, a set of goals that is analogous to other kinds of ism. It's not. So we're led astray by the use of the word. Terrorism. Going along with this is that terrorism as a tactic that is adopted to achieve certain ends, it can be used by groups historically that ascribe to almost every worldview or ideological outcome. We can identify, looking at the historical record, certainly anarchists and socialists and communists and various radical extremist adherents to different world religions. But certainly even those who had very good intentions and sought an end to who used terror as a tactic against tyrannical governments, who sought constitutional states, democracy, and a more egalitarian society. I think one of the best examples to highlight that forces people to question how they have adopted themselves or heard others adopt terrorism is that the South African government accused Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress of being terrorists because of the tactics they used against apartheid in South Africa. Now, we might disagree with the tactics, but I think it would be hard for any of us to disagree and to not sympathize with the goals of the African National Congress. So that's an important one. I've already, I think, started to suggest this. In its own way, when I think qualified in important ways, terrorism is a rational choice. Now, it's certainly sometimes carried out by those who are, oh, come on in, please. Certainly carried out sometimes by those who are mentally unhinged, to put it delicately, who are sociopaths, psychopaths, which I guess are no longer actually terms embraced by the psychology community, but which have resonance in the broader population. That while it is certainly sometimes embraced by those who have who are insane, I suppose. It's typically not associated with the leaders of movements, of campaigns that use terrorism. It becomes a rational choice, a tactic to achieve certain ends, typically when other avenues are not available. So one of the ways that terrorism is often described, and I would further contextualize it, but I wouldn't essentially disagree with it, is the notion that terrorism is a weapon of the weak. In most places, in most times, in most societies, people who are seeking change seek the easiest, not necessarily the least violent, but the most legitimate sorts of means. Well, okay, in democratic societies, that means the ballot box. That means starting a movement, starting a club, starting an organization, starting a political party, putting forth others or yourself as candidates, and trying to get change brought about legally, constitutionally, through recognized means. Well, there are a lot of ways why that doesn't necessarily work. Either a group doesn't have the money, doesn't have the numbers, or because the idea is held to by such a small part of the population. But if they're convinced enough about the righteousness of the cause, they find other ways. In other times and places, of course, those seeking to change the political status quo, to seek political outcomes, take to the battlefield, organize a revolution, an insurrection, maybe draw in support, are able to organize and arm themselves, take to the battlefield even, and win by force of arms and defeat a foe. Of course, in a lot of times and places, that's not been possible, either because the enemy is so large, is so well armed, or perhaps is backed by a population that supports it. And so those who embrace terrorism quite often do so because other avenues simply are not available. So terrorism becomes a means of effecting great change, so their hope is, even when they have very few resources, either in terms of numbers, in terms of arms, in terms of money, in terms of popular support. And so they try to find ways to level the playing field. In military speak, the phrase that's sometimes used is a force multiplier. Use something, whether it be a particular kind of weapon, whether it be a particular tactic, whether it be knowledge of the territory, surprise, ambush, whatever it might be, that allows small numbers to carry on a conflict against large numbers. Terrorism has often been used in that way. Essentially, as I said, basically with the example of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Many of the Klansmen were Confederate veterans who were not interested in ending the struggle, or they were civilians who were sympathetic, who were not willing to recognize the outcome of a war, and so continued the conflict by other means. And as I think not just suggested, but I said, in 1877, achieved a kind of victory that really overturned the Civil War's results in important ways. The African Americans in the South were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as of course the movie theater now reminds us. But in a sense, they were re-enslaved by the imposition of Jim Crow laws that were in large part a result of the victory of the Klan. So it's a rational choice often when other means are not available. And again, here, I hope you're hearing that I'm trying not to attach any sort of moralism to that either way, because that, I think, can become dangerous, fully recognizing that quite often when terrorism is used, it's used obviously very despicable, for its very despicable ends. Further clarify what I've already suggested, terrorism is neither simply war or crime. Now, of course, in the United States, even before the term terrorism was widely adopted or recognized, most of what one did as a terrorist was recognized as a crime. You beat somebody, you lynch them, you murder them, whatever you want to call it. Well, those were crimes at the local, the state, and the federal level. And so, while terrorism can perhaps be combated or prosecuted as a crime, it's also distinct from crime. And usually the way scholars think about this is to identify the fact that crime at its essence is self-serving. One kills others, perhaps out of revenge to satisfy personal motives, or to get money. You rob a bank, you mug somebody, so on and so forth, to satisfy your own immediate needs or ends, your selfish desires. But that acts of terrorism are really quite distinct from that, because when one carries out an act of terrorism, one does not ostensibly do it for his or herself. You do it to advance a cause. Now, as I've said before, terrorism in and of itself is not an ideology. You can have socialists, you can have anarchist terrorists, you can have nationalist terrorists, you can have those who are inspired by religion, you can have all sorts of outcomes sought. But the idea, generally speaking, is that you do something, in fact, often it's as if you take on a burden. You're willing to imperil yourself and maybe even do nasty things, but for the benefit of others, almost like a Robin Hood. I think really, if you push it just a little bit, you can, from that perspective, distinguish terrorism from crime by thinking about, even acknowledging the fact that terrorists, at least in their own minds, are philanthropists, are altruists, who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of others, for a cause. You know, it may not be a cause that many other people back. And maybe the people on whose behalf you're bombing airplanes or killing people or bringing down buildings don't want the good work that you're doing for them. Nevertheless, there is an element of motive there that's very important that distinguishes it from crime. On the other hand, I think we can certainly entertain a lot of scenarios in which terrorism can be a facet of warfare. And I suggested that before in talking about the Civil War, the way that Bleeding Kansas was already the Civil War before the Civil War, in essence, and how the patterns established by the violence of the cross-border raids in the late 50s became most of how the violence was carried out during the Civil War in that part of the country. Nevertheless, terrorism is distinct still from war, because if we were to caricature how war is carried out, not just that it's carried out by uniformed individuals, but that it is fought primarily either to physically eliminate an enemy, incapacitate an enemy, seize territory, deny the enemy the use of population or resources, and that there can come a moment where the enemy is forced to say, "Uncle, I give up. I cannot carry out this conflict any longer. The struggle has to cease." And that the tactics and the strategies of conventional warfare are developed to achieve direct results. Now that could be either through lightning warfare or attrition. There are all sorts of ways to imagine this. But terrorism is used in very different ways, not to achieve results directly by fighting for territory or for fighting for control of the population, or by inflicting devastating or debilitating casualties. That's not how an actor that uses terrorism seeks results. We, of course, I think when speaking of 9/11, first and foremost, made aware and horrified by the scale of the violence. And 3,000 is a horrifying number, but in terms of the scale of warfare, that's a rounding error during World War II, even during specific engagements. Bin Laden certainly wanted to kill lots of people on 9/11, but he didn't imagine that by killing a few more or a few less, he would be more or less successful. The numbers killed were incidental, and of course he didn't really, in a sense, care who was killed. He wasn't trying to, even by attacking the Pentagon, Bin Laden entertained no notion that if I inflict sufficient damage on the Pentagon, the United States will be incapable of conducting military operations. If I behead the Pentagon, the United States will surrender because they won't be able to carry out military operations. He didn't entertain that idea at all. The goal was sought indirectly. So it's really different from crime in that it is not selfish, I think we might say. Although, again, many terrorists individually get involved in terrorism to satisfy personal needs. But in terms of those who conceptualize terror as a tactic towards a particular, as part of a strategy to suit a particular end, it's in that sense altruistic. But then it's also different from war because the warfare is not for territory or for numbers, and the goals sought are imagined to be sought indirectly. Well, how? This raises the question of how is terrorism going to achieve perhaps the aims of warfare, but by very different means. And this, I think, begins to get to a shorthand version of how I imagine terrorism and how I, time and time again, go back to teaching terrorism, which is that terrorism is symbolic violence. I think over time, looking at the history of the way in which these particular and peculiar kinds of violence have been used, that over time have sort of aggregated themselves into something that we today call terrorism, that scholars call terrorism, that lay people call terrorism as well. These things that have become what I call part of the terrorist toolbox. And that can be assassination, it can be the mass casualty event of 9/11, it can be violence carried out against buildings, in fact, when there are no human casualties involved. It can even be the threat of violence. What is always important is that it is symbolic. The target is chosen, again, rationally, within a certain worldview, by those who choose to act this way. The target is chosen to have particular and peculiar resonance. That targets are chosen, and often the means of attacking them is chosen to have symbolic value. Another way another term that I use a lot, terrorism is theatrical. It is spectacle. It is violence both in its means and its target and perhaps the motives and the ends associated with it that is supposed to turn heads, get headlines, capture the attention of people, and influence them. I emphasize symbolic because this gets back to the notion of how those who use terrorism seek to gain the results indirectly, wildly out of proportion to the resources they use, and of course also typically wildly out of proportion to the actual scale of the violence. 9/11, again, even though I'm always tempted to reach back into history, I'm a historian, so the further the better, 9/11 provides so many illustrations. The 9/11 operation is developed by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and rubber stamped by, approved by Osama bin Laden, head up by Mohammed Atta and the 19 hijackers, so on and so forth. It cost $400,000 to $500,000 to pull off. It cost $500,000, which to me is a large sum of money. But for those who imagine that they're changing world history, it's chump change. For a $500,000 investment, and of course the willingness to mercilessly kill others and sacrifice themselves, they inflicted billions of dollars of damage. They killed 3,000 people, but indirectly achieved results wildly out of proportion to their own investment. I mean, if you want to think about this as the business model of terrorism, that's an incredible return on investment. It created the narrative, it links together 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, the development of homeland security, a whole host of responses. The expenditure of, by now, trillions of dollars. And what did Al-Qaeda spend? Less than $500,000. Yeah. So that's a force multiplier as well. And why? How were they able to achieve it? If they were a uniformed army that made a cross-border incursion from Canada and attacked a border guard, they would have been, dismissed as a bunch of nuts, something insignificant, so on and so forth. But because of the spectacular nature of the violence, because of the symbolic value of the targets, they achieved a resonance far beyond their own financial investment in the act. Symbolic because the goal is to provoke as well. And this is also, I think, why the word theatrical is helpful, is appropriate. When you think of a theatrical performance, what do you have to have at a performance?
Stage.
You have to have a stage. Yeah. For most people, the bigger the better. Yeah. What else?
An audience.
You have to have an audience. You have to have an audience. Me standing in a room by myself, it might be the most brilliant performance of the Hamlet soliloquy ever. But I'd hardly call it a bit of theater, unless I'm that self-deluded that maybe looking in the mirror, I can imagine what everybody else might respond to. You need an audience, and terrorism needs an audience. And this is often how efforts to define terrorism merely in terms of who the victims are, what the motive is, what the context is, often are, in the end, to me, are unsatisfactory. Because terrorism isn't simply in the intent to change people's behavior. Terrorism isn't simply that the people victimized were civilians. Terrorism isn't simply that the motive was to change behaviors, whatever it might be. But that terrorism is a stage and an audience. And that, in a sense, terrorism resides in that moment between the perpetrator and not just the victim, but the entire audience viewing it. And in a sense, if the audience chooses to see an act of violence as terrorism, it is then terrorism, because it's communicating. So another way I think of it is terrorism as a communicative act, which sounds like an overly jargonistic way of thinking about it, but it's a sort of violence that's meant to communicate something, not simply eliminate the enemy. That's, again, what I would call warfare. And it's not simply to achieve one's own personal aims, to enrich oneself, but it's on behalf of a cause. And that cause could be political, it could be ideological, it could be social, it could be economic, it could be religious. But in that sense, it's always really, I would call it political. So terrorism, symbolic violence. So I always ask, when students are reading, looking at a set of readings, when they're looking at headlines, when they're looking at newspapers, when they're dealing with something that someone has chosen to call terrorism, say, let's try to break this down. And the question that once they have this framework in place, I ask is who is the audience? For whom was this violence intended? And of course, I think we tend to, when thinking about terrorism, we personalize it. It's impossible not to, when thinking about 9/11, to not think about the people in the airplanes as they were heading towards the towers or the Pentagon or the field in Pennsylvania. Or to imagine the people trapped in the building, the famous falling man. The people involved, we personalize it, thereby taking an event, an act of violence that was targeted against a small number of people and inserting ourselves into it. We make ourselves part of that audience. What's important to think about here when thinking about who is the audience is not to become overly limited by the terror of terrorism and to assume that the significance of terrorism, the aim of terrorism is simply to intimidate. Quite often, the audience for an act of terrorism is one that those carrying out the violence hope to positively impact, to unite, to recruit, to give them a sense of purpose or empowerment. So terrorism isn't just a kind of symbolic violence that is meant to intimidate a people and thereby change their behavior and therefore change a society or a government's behavior. It can also be carried out with almost no care in the world about how the victim in that society responds, as long as another audience appreciates positively the violence of that symbolic act of terrorism. And here a great example, one again actually is 9/11. We don't have to go back too far in history to come up with a good example. 9/11, I think it's not inappropriate for Americans and the fellow nationalists of the other people, the other international people who died when the towers came down. It's appropriate to say, why did they do that against us? We tend to lose track, though, of the other motivations that bin Laden and al-Qaeda had, which was that they were trying to hold together a transnational group, basically a private army assembled by bin Laden, that was composed of Muslims, but not all Arabs. There were Egyptians and Saudis and some Palestinians and so on and so forth, to be sure. But there were also people from Chechnya and Indonesia and India and others who were non-Arab. And so they were, even the Arabs themselves were divided as much as they were united by their ethnicity and their language. Sit an Egyptian and a Syrian down, and you'll find out very quickly that they have as many bones to pick as they have points of similarity, even in terms of spoken Arabic, for instance. Bin Laden was trying to hold together a transnational jihadist movement that was fragmenting, because most of those involved had a background that programmed them to be first and foremost concerned about getting rid of the tyrant back home, getting rid of Mubarak, getting rid of the king of Saudi Arabia, getting rid of, again, of the democratic government of Turkey, getting rid of Assad in Syria, so on and so forth. And bin Laden was really quite concerned that this movement that he had brought together, where? In Afghanistan, fighting against a common enemy, a superpower, the Soviet Union, was going to fall apart. It took him several years to figure it out, but he came upon, I guess, what is something quite brilliant, not only the explanation that it's not really your local tyrant who has made it difficult for you to live the Islamic life that you believe is worth living. It's the far enemy behind the near enemy, behind the local despot. It is the United States that funds Israel, as the jihadists call it, this crusader kingdom in the middle of our civilization. They're the ones who fund Mubarak and the Saudi princes and so on and so forth. They're the ones that we should go after. So 9/11 was just as much intended as a focal point to bring together a fragmenting transnational movement. And if it was successful, it could be used as a rallying cry. Look what we are capable of when we unite our strengths. In a sense, irrespective of what the American reaction was, it served its purpose in forging and further bringing together Al-Qaeda and this jihadist movement. But of course, there was another part of it. So it's not just the positive element. Another element that I emphasize is provocation. And this is an element that also goes back to how, when thinking of it not as war crime, the goal is to be achieved indirectly. I can spell. Andy, help me. There we go. It's the chalk. If you can't beat the enemy, cause the enemy to react in a way that is counterproductive. Defeat the enemy by getting the enemy to defeat itself. And for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, part of that was draw the United States into a war on territory so that the righteous defenders of Islam can benefit, and so that they will be united, and so that they can bring down the great enemy as superpower. Provocation, force the enemy to adopt tactics, to adopt strategies, to adopt behaviors that sway people to the side of terrorism. This is, of course, a tactic used by the PLO and related groups all the time. If we can get the Israelis to look like the terrorists, we win. If we can, because we win in the court of international opinion. If we, not because we've defeated them on the battlefield, because of course the Palestinians and the Arabs have found out time and time again that they can't win that war for various sorts of reasons, or at least they've tried, they haven't won it so far. Let's get the Israelis to do things so that the international opinion turns against them and sees them as the illegitimate actor. So, of course, the moment that the state of Israel mobilizes the IDF and sends troops into Lebanon or the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah or Hamas rubs their hand in glee. Not because oh no, the IDF is coming and probably many of us are going to die, and if we have to duke it out in the streets, we're going to be defeated. But look how this is going to play to the cameras. Israeli bombs raining down on Palestinian homes. Look at what they will be forced to do to defeat us. And of course there's a calculus involved in that, and it's utterly rational. What's the most violence that we can carry out, we being the terrorists? If you're going to teach terrorism, you have to think like a terrorist. I come from the school of method teaching. If you're going to teach it, you have to look it as well. So you can call it a terrorist on many occasions. So the we is terrorists. How much violence can we carry out that publicizes our cause, that sways audiences, that changes opinion, but that doesn't turn people against us? And this is, of course, one of the problems that the PLO often faced and usually didn't negotiate very well. And it began in 1968 with the advent of international terrorism. The People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, one of these subgroups of the PLO, incidentally enough, headed by a Christian, wasn't even Muslim, George Habash. The PFLP started hijacking planes, and he was scrupulous in his instructions: don't kill anybody. Don't kill anybody. But stage the spectacular act. Seize an airplane. Maybe act kind of crazy. Make sure you get the cameras on you. Take that plane from, instead of Rome to Tel Aviv, take it to Damascus or something. Land it on the tarmac. Publish your list of demands with all the cameras rolling. Get all the passengers off the plane, and then blow the plane up. So you cause millions of dollars of damage, but you don't disturb a hair on anybody's head. And sure enough, it got a lot of people around the world saying, who the hell are the Palestinians? And why are they so anxious? Why are they so angry? Of course, it didn't take very long before some of these hijackings began to descend into violence. By the next year, there were PFLP terrorist teams that were storming planes saying, kill all the Jews! So the scrupulous instructions to calibrate the violence didn't last very long for, I think, some reasons that we can all probably recognize. Provocation is a very, very important element. Provoke the enemy to act. I imagine many of you have come across this in news accounts, or you've reflected on it and thought this yourself as well. Abu Ghraib is a good example of this. The scale of violence being carried out during the occupation by insurgent groups, guerrilla groups, terrorist groups against American forces, mostly against other Iraqis, was horrendous. And I think to a great degree Abu Ghraib was relatively isolated. And yet the way it played publicly could not have better suited the insurgents and the terrorists, particularly Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who were operating there. The Americans, they come here, they're going to spread democracy, they're going to show us the proper way to live. What do? They round up thousands of people, they pay no attention to their own standards of jurisprudence or search and seizure, and they are starting to indiscriminately humiliate the people that they've rounded up, the use of torture, so on and so forth. Look at the Americans. Hypocrisy is always a great charge that, oddly enough, terrorists and those who adopt that tactic like to use. And shift the target, shift the field of discussion from the violence the terror acts being carried out to the reactions of the state or other sub-state national groups might use